Taxi drivers at Reddit, have anyone actually jumped into your taxi and screamed follow that car? If yes, what happened? Oh god, I have a really bad story for this. I used to drive a taxi for my uncle's company. A guy gets in my taxi, says just follow that car and reassures me it's nothing serious. Except when the other car stops. He gets out and runs to the car we were following and drags the guy out and starts hitting him in the face. Hard. I got out and was yelling at him and calling him an asshole for lying to me. And he got all in my face and threatened to beat the shit out of me too. Said a bunch of racist slurs at me. Then ran off. The guy who got punched had his nose broken. The weirdest part is that he had no idea who that guy was. Yes. But it's usually followed by I've always wanted to say that. I was in New Orleans once and a cab I was in got sideswiped by a drunk driver. The drunk driver then took off. I told the cab to follow him, which he did. We ended up in a parking lot and we watched them go into an apartment building. Cabbie had the station call the cops. I wrote a statement for the cabbie and he called me a new cab while he wanted for the cops. I did that once as a passenger. We said it as a joke. We were in a group of 6 and couldn't fit in a single cab. So I went into the second cab and said, follow that cab. We expected the driver to laugh it off and ask for our destination. Instead, he just took off and followed the first cab. He'd been waiting for that moment. I left my flute on a bus. I was not about to get my ass whooped for forgetting my $1,000 silver hollow stick on my way to orchestra practice. I drove a taxi one summer in a party resort. One night, 2 guys jumped in and yelled follow that car. Which was another taxi that I knew the driver of and I obliged. Turns out, one of their mates was drunk AF and decided to just go to their hotel without telling them. They only saw the guy leaving the club drunk and they thought he was going to a strip club without them. He was actually going to their hotel. As he was hammered. Another time 3 girls jumped in the car and said follow that car. The car in question was a black sedan. Tinted back windows. It wasn't that shady imho. We follow the car for 15 minutes. Leaving the resort going into a forest. The girls start freaking out. As one of their friends, also a girl, was seen stepping into that car. Yeah. Turns out that she just hooked up with some guy in the club they were earlier and she was about to suck his D when we pulled up next to them. Weirdest summer. Honestly, those are good friends. A personal trainer at my old gym did this. He saw a guy shoot another guy in the head and jump into a car. So he got into a cab so the shooter wouldn't get away. The cabbie followed the car for a bit until he learned that he was following a murderer. Then he pulled over and refused. Turns out, the shooter was an undercover police officer who sped away because he thought the victim's friends would get to the scene before the cops. I followed the car. It stopped in a suburban house. Dude went into the house. They were his family and didn't have room for him with them. This sort of happened to me about 20 years ago. Not a taxi driver, although I was driving down a main road and saw a dude running around with a baseball bat and then come cop cars parked on a side street. Young me decided that I want to get involved, so I pulled down the side street and found a cop on foot a good distance away from his car. I told him about baseball bat guy and he gets on his radio. Guess he got an immediate update on his radio. Looks at how far he is from his car and he says, "Can you drive me down the road?" I'm thinking FCK yeah. And tell him to jump in. He does. And I am seriously driving around back roads with a cop riding shotgun giving me directions while on his radio. Only lasted for about 2 minutes and then he jumps out to pursue the guy on foot. Not a very satisfying ending to the story, since I never found out what happened. I asked a taxi driver that question many years back. He said that happened on 2 separate occasions and both times, a wife was trying to catch her cheating husband committing adultery. Update. I have been getting a lot of comments on whether the husband cheated on the wife twice. I'm not sure about that, but the story that I was told was 2 different couples. Also, One of the wives actually caught her husband meeting his mistress. Not quite what OP asked. But almost. A colleague of mine, a UK police officer, was on foot patrol and saw robbery in the distance where a driver was pulled from their car and the robbers drove off in their car. My mate did exactly as OP has said. Stopped a civilian car and said follow that car. The driver apparently went wild trying to keep up with the robbers, all the time with a uniformed police officer in his passenger seat, giving a commentary to his base. They lost the stolen car. And my colleague asked his driver to stop. He got out and let the driver go without asking his details. As the driver went into the distance, my mate realized he'd taken out his truncheon in the car and left it on the dashboard. Luckily the driver rang in later and it was returned. No idea what happened to the robbers. Stolen car or victim. Truncheon. Thank God you said truncheon because I was not about to Google cop peg at work. Not a taxi driver, but when I was 18 driving home late at night in Seattle and I was rear-ended by a guy, and when I tried to call the cops from a payphone, it was 1992, he pulled a gun on me and told me to get in his trunk, so I knocked him down and ran, and luckily there was a cab sitting there at a red light, so I got to jump into it and yell, "Drive. Just drive." He didn't hesitate. Just took off. Dude stayed with me at the 7-11 until the cops came. I won't forget that. I was pretty shaken up. If you're out there reading this now, thanks taxi driver dude. I had a fair jump in my car, who immediately started berating about my car and how Uber does not allow drivers to use two-door cars. This came as a surprise to me because I was not, and never have been, an Uber driver. I was just parked in front of the hotel waiting for a friend. This has happened to me twice. The second time the girl was so glued to her phone that she didn't even make eye contact. I let it roll for a couple seconds before I finally asked her why she was in my car. She looked up, wordlessly opened the door, and disappeared into the night. Really makes you think about how the world has changed when it's normal to pop into a stranger's backseat but weird to talk to them once you're in. Not a taxi driver. But one time after a work party, a bunch of co-workers and I were going to a different bar and we needed to take cabs. A few of us got into one and the rest in another. One of my co-workers told our cabbie, "Hey, if you can beat that other cab, I'll give you an extra $20. The cabbie smiled in the rear view and said, "Okay, buddy." He started weaving between cars until he got in front of the other cab. Then he perfectly timed it so he could get the other cab stuck at a red light while he just made it past. With that head start he had no need to really rush and he calmly got us to the bar first. I think he actually really enjoyed it and got a pretty nice tip for a short trip. The opposite. I was driving in London, utterly confused, as this was my first drive on the left side of the road and pre-GPS. So I had absolutely no clue how to get where I needed to be. So I stopped a black taxi, and asked him to chaperone me to the address. "Follow my car," he shouted, and set off at breakneck speed down taxi lanes, weaving in and out of traffic. Remember that all black cabs are identical and London is teeming with them. I have never been so focused or strengthened in my life. Not a cab driver, but once at port in Spain on deployment we were late in getting back to ship, so we jumped in a cab and said there's a good tip your way if you get us there before 10:30. We were there by 10:15 and it was the scariest car ride of my life. It was amazing. Friend driving a cab had this happen once. It was college students out on the town and their friends got into a cab just prior to them. Yes. He chased it to wherever they went. Tipped him nice, he said. Very anticlimactic. I've done it to a cab driver. I parted ways with a friend and as soon as they got into their cab, I realized that I left my phone in their bag. In a panic state, I grabbed the next cab and told him to follow the cab a block away. I had to explain myself because I didn't want to seem like a creep. He obliged and I had him sidle up next to them so I could get her attention. Both cans pulled over and I got my phone. Not the most exciting story, but it still applies. A man was trying to pick up some garbage. He was a dumpster trucker or whatever, and his pal drove off thinking he was in the back. The man ran to my car, kept knocking on my window and said to follow that truck in a voice so loud Nick could hear, and hopped in. I'm pretty sure I drove a red light to get to the dumpster truck. He paid me a 20 so it was worth it. I was actually the person who jumped in the car and said follow that bus. And then try to get to the next stop before the bus. Please. It's important. I had forgotten my phone. And that was the only thing I could think of. There was no way I'd outrun the bus. Had to cross a big boulevard and wait at the traffic light. And after that it was a long stretch where I'd stand no chance. The guy actually made it. And even told me to just go and not pay anything. To be fair, it took him like a minute or two anyway, but still. So cheers to you. Random genuinely nice taxi driver. You are a gentleman and a scholar. I did jump in a taxi and tell them to stop that bus. Bus indeed completely ignored me at the station. And it was the last one of the day. Better stop it than do the entire trip by taxi. It's less expensive. Taxi reached the bus 1 kilometer later. Stopped in the middle of the street while I paid him. Bus driver furious, but I threatened him I had the proof he was ignoring passengers at stops. Went home. Told story. No one believed me. Reddit? Will you believe me? My friend used to drive a rickshaw in Glasgow. One night 2 huge guys jumped in and said go. And he did as he was told to discover they were being chased by the police. When he was, very quickly, stopped by the police, the men were apprehended and were placed in a police van. Only to see the police van rock violently. The doors burst open and the men fleeing. I'm not sure how much of that story is true. But 2 guys using a rickshaw as a getaway vehicle is the most Glaswegian thing I've ever heard. This is gonna be chopped up into a 19-page BuzzFeed article tomorrow. Wasn't a taxi and this kinda flips it around. But my partner and I had some guy take off on us on foot and we were chasing him down a semi-major road. But he was smoking us. Some random person in a minivan pulled over. Yelled jump in. And then dropped us off just in front of him. The guy was totally gassed by that point and just proned himself out on the ground when we jumped out. Seriously, was like something in movie. Not a taxi driver but a private chauffeur. I regularly drive drunk rich people home after luxury dinners with excessive complimentary wine tastings. On one occasion my customer got in, very drunk, and shouted for me to follow a black Jaguar. This was the car of his friend, who was DUI. For the entire ride, my customer shouted at me to go faster, while also on the phone with his friend, cursing at him and laughing. When the friend stopped at a red light, he ordered me to pull up as close to the Jaguar as possible. Then rolled down the window and puked against the side of his friend's car. Ugly car, he said. Then puked again as his friend shouted through his car window how my customer couldn't drink like a man. That friend promised me a tip, but ended up speeding off after my customer had hung up the phone and started snoring from the back seat. I ended up having to carry my customer to his doorstep. No tips. When my dad was growing up in the 1960s, he used to do this and slam the door without getting in. He and his friends would laugh as the cab took off with no one inside. My dad was kind of a dick. Not me, but my ex. And a theft sort of answer. Maybe 4 years or so ago my bear friend and I had just gotten in an Uber outside a club. This college age guy hopped in after us and basically sat on my lap and screamed follow that car. I screamed my head off. My friend tried to push him out the door. He got out and high-fived all his friends like he'd pulled the funniest joke ever. Uber driver pulled over and told a bike cop and the guy was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. That's one brave dude jumping in the back of a cab with you and your bear. I drove Uber for a little while in New Orleans. Do not recommend. And immediately after dropping someone off in the French Quarter had a woman jump in the back with 6-inch bedazzled heels and yell follow that car. Turned out she worked at a local strip club and had left her phone in the car of a guy she wasn't keen to see again. Unfortunately we couldn't catch up to him, so I just took her back to her place of work. Not a taxi driver. But I'm walking up to the West Seattle Street Fair with the GF. When bam, this Forester jumps a curb and proceeds to sideswipe another car. Cross traffic magically connected the dots and we go running. Chick is still driving down the road. Hits a traffic circle. Keeps going. Dude pulls up next to me and yells, "That a hit and run?" Yup. Get it? I cowboy up riding shotgun in dude's pickup. He chase druggish teabag down for about a mile before she stops. Get her info. And get it back to the owner of the vehicle. In the end, my adrenaline riddled brain was so focused on getting her info, I didn't call the cops. Which I should have. I did find out through the owner of the victim car they eventually got her, though, before more damage was done. Victory. I used to be a taxi driver a few years and this has happened on a few occasions, but here's my favorite and most wholesome. I was called to a house in the suburbs. A small but well kept house. I waited outside for a few minutes and got a little bored as he said it was urgent. When they finally came out they told me to drive to the highway and wait until we saw a baby blue Jaguar. Weird request, but I did so. Seemingly an easy car to spot. Another 10 minutes pass, meanwhile we're just sat in silence. Once we saw the car he shouted follow that car, so I pulled out and started to drive. Until the client told me to pull over. The blue Jaguar had pulled in too. Turned out to be his brother who he hadn't seen in over 4 years due to military work. We talked for a good while, explaining their story and so on, and then the client got into his brother's car so they could visit their parents. Close bracket. TLDR. Waited ages. Client gave weird request and it turned out to be his long time no see brother. Not actually answering the question. But anyway. A few years ago, I called a taxi to pick me up. And when it arrived, I jumped in and said follow that car. The driver looked at me kinda strangely in the rearview mirror. And I said sorry. I've just always wanted to say that, and he said I've always wanted someone to jump in my car and say that. And we mentally high-fived each other and had a lovely chat on the way to the airport. And he got a huge tip for being such a sport. I am not a taxi driver. Lol. But I did this as a passenger. My entire extended family except one cousin was in Cleveland for a wedding, and 2 nights prior to the wedding, we went all out drinking. My other cousin decides it was time for a change in venue, so we grabbed cabs and mine was the middle one, so here was my chance, so I shouted follow that car and it was glorious and I thought I hit my stride. Then cousin calls the one cousin not in town. Puts the phone on speaker and shouts, "We're all in the cash cab. Who is the Prime Minister of England? Quick! Cash money is on the line." I've got the FK'd up reversal of this story that happened to the GF. She showed up at family's house in a taxi for a short stay. Got out. Hugged the uncle and aunt. Then turned around to get her bags to see the taxi pulling away 50 feet down the road. As luck would have it, and she's been remarkably lucky like this several times in her life, an ice cream truck, of all things, was ambling through the neighborhood. So she jumps on the running board and cries out follow that cab. To dude's credit, he did. Wound that thing up to a blistering 40 some mph. It may have hit 50 before the law of aerodynamics said hol up there. Brick face. Fortunately, it being a residential area, there were numerous stop signs, so they caught up in a couple blocks. I suppose the driver was like, what the FCK is with this impatient ass ice cream truck honking at me for? Until the GF ran up and waved him down to retrieve her suitcase from the trunk. Pretty sure the ice cream man got a sale and tip. I had a woman one time stop a car in front of me and yell get in. There's no time to explain. After a second, she cackled and drove off. One of the funniest things I've ever seen. Some local government person got in my Uber and said he would give turn-by-turn directions including stop plus go and to go around any police barricades. I drove them around to visit key points in a marathon. It went very smoothly and the police didn't even stop slouching as I drove around the barriers and over sidewalks. Almost. They said follow that Carl. I did. I misjudged Carl's foot speed. Now I'm no longer allowed to drive. I did this with an Uber driver. We were also in a group large enough to need 2 Ubers, so it was just to the next brewery.